Hi everyone. So today we'll go over the book by the philosopher Timothy Morton, Hyperobjects, Philosophy and Ecology After the End of the World. It's one of those books that got a very cool cover, and also one of the books in which the content, of course, is as good or better as the cover design. So the book was published in 2013, and it offers a new and innovative philosophical way to look at global warming. Morton stresses that it is better to talk about global warming rather than using the term climate change, because in his terms, climate change as substitute enables cynical reason, both right-wing and left, to say that the climate has always been changing, which to my ears sounds like using people have always been killing one another as a fatuous reason not to control the sale of machine guns. So he prefers the term global warming because it is specific and it doesn't have this, naturalistic fallacy which can give reasons to people not to care about it, So Morton tells us that global warming will be better dealt with if we take it as it really is, and that is a hyperobject. So he explained what that is from page 1. He says the term hyperobjects refer to things that are massively distributed in time and space relative to humans. Hyperobjects then are hyper in relation to some other entity, whether they are directly manufactured by humans or not. So two things here. First, hyperobjects can be both natural or man-made, and they are hyper relatively to humans. Like imagine something that is so big compared to the size of human beings to the point where seeing it in its entirety kind of becomes impossible. Quote, global warming cannot be directly seen, but it can be thought and computed. This means that you can only see it in terms of its parts or through some sort of inferences or graphs or maps, just like many other hyperobjects. He gives a few examples, like a black hole, for example. A hyperobject could be a black hole. A hyperobject can be the Lago Agrio oil field in Ecuador or the Florida Everglades. A hyperobject could be the biosphere or the solar system. A hyperobject could be the sum total of all the nuclear materials on Earth, or just the plutonium or the uranium. A hyperobject could be the very long-lasting product of direct human manufacture, such as styrofoam, I think that's how it's pronounced, or plastic bags, or the sum of all the wiring machinery of capitalism. So anything that has such a big scale that a human brain needs a lot to process. So this means that maybe for hypothetical hyper beings, what we consider a hyper object can probably be a regular object for them. Okay, so imagine a higher being from another dimension. For them, a hyper object would be like any object for us. So Morton then explains that there are 5 properties of hyperobjects. He says that they are viscous, which means that they stick to beings that are involved with them. They are non-local. In other words, any local manifestation of a hyperobject is not directly the hyperobject. They involve profound different temporalities than the human scale ones we are used to. Hyperobjects occupy a high-dimensional phase space that results in their being invisible to humans for stretches of time. And this is important. Hyperobjects cannot be seen directly because they're not only massively spread in space, but also in time. That's the third property, temporal undulations, which says that hyperobjects are time stretched to such a vast extent that they become almost impossible to hold in mind. So you can think of the age of the universe, for example, or how long it took for the Earth to form. When someone tells you that the universe is 15 billion years old, it's difficult to process, right? Like what 14 billion years are like, Like it can be very anxious to think that our universe is that old and we are here for, not even half of 1 million years. Like human beings are just here for like 200,000 years, and you know, it can be mind blowing. And so another thing about hyperobjects is that they exhibit their effects interobjectively. That is, they can be detected in a space that consists of interrelationships between aesthetic properties of objects. They are interconnected, connected with objects. And the last property is phasing. Hyperobjects seem to phase in and out of the human world. Hyperobjects are phased. They occupy a high-dimensional phase space that makes them impossible to be seen as a whole on a regular three-dimensional human-scale basis. We can only see pieces of hyperobjects at a time. So those are the 5 qualities of hyperobjects. They are viscous, they stick to you, they are non-local, and they have temporal undulation. They stretch massively through time and space. They are experienced through interobjectivity and in phases. So obviously we will explain what those are in details, but the main argument of the book is that our current model to deal with global warming, well, it's not efficient because it is unfit to deal with hyperobjects. And so a lot of deniers, for example, Morton says, are kind of right to be skeptical about global warming if they don't consider it as a hyperobject. And that's for a specific reason. Deniers don't believe in the end of the world, which for Morton already happened. Now, this also means that environmentalists are also wrong because they tell us that the apocalypse will happen if we don't act now. But if the end of the world already happened, which Morton seems to believe, then they're wrong. To quote, hyperobjects are directly responsible for what I call the end of the world, rendering both denialism and apocalyptic environmentalism obsolete. So Morton says we're already in the end of the world, and so we have to look at our age as such, as an age that is after the end of the world. Like hyperobjects, the end of the world also has its characteristics. And the characteristics of the end of the world are 3: hypocrisy, weakness, and lameness. To quote Morton, hypocrisy results from the conditions of the impossibility of a meta-language, and as I shall explain, we are now freshly aware of these conditions because of the ecological emergency, and we will explain what he means by meta-language. Weakness from the gap between phenomenon and thing, which the hyperobject makes disturbingly visible, and then lameness from the fact that all entities are fragile as a condition of possibility for their existence, and hyperobjects make this fragility conspicuous. And he also adds that such an age in which you have these 3 characteristics is called the age of asymmetry. And he argues that you can watch its effect in modern art, like contemporary artists, according to Morton, have a grasp of on hyperobjects, and you can experience them through their art. These new forms of art and the hyperobjects, which for Morton aren't just some things that we make up. All right, it's not just a matter of perception. Hyperobjects do exist objectively, you know. To quote, hyperobjects are not just collections, systems, or assemblages of other objects. They are objects in their own right. Least of all, then, would it be right to say that hyperobjects are figments of the human imaginations. Hyperobjects are real whether or not someone is thinking of them. So hyperobjects, they are real, and they present a new challenge to philosophy. And so mainly 2 tasks are given to philosophy according to Morton. The first task is to abolish the idea of the possibility of a meta-language that could account for things while remaining uncontaminated by them. And the second task is to establish what phenomenological experience is in the absence of anything meaningfully like a world at all. Now we will explain what those two tasks are, but what it is basically doing here is arguing that we need a shift in the ways that we've been doing philosophy until recently. Like with global warming, it came in a new way to look at history in which human activity can no longer be separate from geological history. What we do also impact the Earth and vice versa. So human history is now also the history of the planet. And he says that this daunting, indeed horrifying coincidence of human history and terrestrial geology, as he calls it, it brought about a new philosophical movement called speculative realism. And the members of this movement are determined to break the spell that descended on philosophy since the Romantic period. The spell is known as correlationism, the notion that philosophy can only talk within a narrow bandwidth restricted to the human world correlate. Meaning is only possible between a human mind and what it thinks, its objects, flimsy and tenuous as they are. So in other words, these philosophers want to deconstruct, now the philosophers from the speculative realism movement, they want to deconstruct the relation human world or subject-object, saying that there are too many other ways to create meaning than just, throughout the perception of a subject contemplating a world of objects. To get a little bit technical, this goes back to the modern period with Descartes, who actualized the scholastic ontology of the Middle Ages. The belief was like things were not what they seem, they're not what we see. What we see are accidents of things. When I look at a chair, for example, I see a chair, but the chair is not this appearance that I see in front of me. Okay, the chair is actually a substance, and that substance is not accessible with my senses. So my senses only show me the appearance of the substance. It's kind of like the Matrix. You don't see things as they are, but you see them as they appear. And so after this, you have Immanuel Kant, who went a little bit further and widened the gap between what he called the noumena and the phenomena. Now, the former is the thing in itself, as things truly are, it's the substance, while the former is how they appear. And he argued that those two can never be bridged. Okay, in other words, you can never have access to reality. You are stuck in the matrix. That's basically it. And so after this came what we call the phenomenologist. And so these guys, they wanted to kind of give up on this split between substance and appearance and basically say that either there is no substance, only appearances, or that both substance and appearance are kind of like the same. Okay, like a phenomenon literally means what appears. Okay, so we will only study appearances from now on, and one of the most known phenomenologists is Heidegger. And to quote Morton about Heidegger, Heidegger realized that the cupcakes of substance and the sprinkles of accidents were products of an objective presenting that resulted from a confusion within human being, or Dasein as he put it. And so this basically says that the divide between substance and appearance resulted from a confusion or perhaps a limit of a certain way of thinking, which is, causal thinking, when you are looking for causes. Like this is the kind of thought that leads us to think that everything must have a cause that is greater than the thing, that the cause is more real than its effect, than its consequence, so it is more present than the thing that it caused, like the substance is more present than the appearance. Okay, the substance is the cause of the appearance, and so the substance is giving a it's giving a higher position than the appearance in terms of presence, in terms of realness, and so that's also because substances are like eternal, whereas appearances kind of they fade away. It's like, God is the ultimate substance, and everything that is caused by God is just temporary. And so phenomenologists, however, don't want to think in this causal way, but rather in a more aesthetic way. All right? Like relationship between things, to quote Morton, including causal ones, must be vicarious and hence aesthetic in nature. And so what does this mean, and what does it have to do with hyperobjects or with global warming? Well, in phenomenology, its founder, Edmund Husserl, discovered something strange about objects. Now, no matter how many times you turned around a coin, you never saw the other side as the other side. The coin had a dark side that was seemingly irreducible. So this means that objects always have something of them that is hidden, if you look around you, you never see one object in its entirety, right? But if you see a book, for example, maybe you don't see its back, but you manage to recognize that it is a book. But what if the book is so big that you cannot see it? Like you can see pieces of paper, but they're so big that you cannot see that they're connected. It's like an ant walking on a huge field of paper. It cannot fathom that that paper is part of that piece of paper is part of a many pieces of paper connected together to form a book. Well, with hyperobjects, that's kind of how it works. Their dark side, the withdrawn side of them, is enormous compared to the tiny bits that we perceive. And so in order to have the bigger picture, we need to go through some other means that just direct perception, right? So as Morton says, I can think and compute climate in this sense, but I cannot see it directly or touch it. And so the climate is always withdrawn, okay? It's like the hyperobject, it's always withdrawn. You can only see it, if you want to see it directly, you are only going to see a few bits of it. And so basically, as phenomenology developed, as philosophers were looking at how things appear to us, the more they knew about phenomena, the less they knew about the subject perceiving them, to the point where it reaches the idea that maybe the subject too is itself an appearance, and that the hierarchy implied in the relation, human-world, where a human is the active mind and the world is like the passive object, like this hierarchy doesn't start to lose meaning. It doesn't make sense anymore, and so we better just look at humans as objects as well. And so we move into a relation of world of object instead of a human world or subject object. And so this is one of the main theories that popped from speculative realism by one of their main figures, Graham Harman, and it's called object-oriented ontology, or OOO. Okay, we can just say OOO or OOO. And it is the theory on which Morton builds his whole concept of hyperobjects. If you want a deep analysis of what OOO is, not OOO, I recommend these videos right here, so you can go check them out. Here we will just go through a quick recap of what OOO is, and if you want more detailed analysis, well, you can watch the videos that I recommended. So a problem with correlationists is that they assume that it is perception that determines reality. Okay, so a correlationist is someone who has the subject worldview. So the problem with them is that they assume that, that perception determines reality, or at least how I experience the world. And in this sense, Heidegger was also a correlationist. He just came very close to solve the correlationist problem, but well, he kind of didn't, and that can, at least according to Morton, explain why he joined the Nazi Party. So O tries to finish what Heidegger started, but didn't dare to finish, and that is maintain that there is an objective reality independent of our mind. All right, to quote Morton, Hamann was unwilling to concede Heidegger the point that the physical reality described in Newton's laws did not exist before Newton. And so here we are basically talking about realism, all right? The idea that things are, that the reality is not dependent on our mind, on how we perceive it. And so, although Hamann distinguishes between regular realism or scientific realism, if you want, and speculative realism, it's not the same thing. Because for him, no realism is tenable that only bases its findings on ontic data that are pre-given. This would be like thinking with pre-packaged concepts. It would not be like thinking at all. So you need more than just scientific data, all right? So ontic means observable, physical, real or factual things. So when we talk about realism, it's not just collecting data about an issue. That would be more like scientific realism, but speculative realism goes further than this. Morton doesn't think that you will solve global warming by collecting data on temperature or on sea levels, because we'll be thinking through pre-given and pre-packaged concepts, like we'll just be applying old methodology that is unfit to hyperobjects. And the second point was that Hamann believes that there is no reason to confer to Dasein any unique or special place relative to other beings. Quote, there is a vast plenum of unique entities, one of whose essential properties is withdrawal. No other entity can fully account for them. These entities must exist in a relatively flat ontology in which there is hardly any difference between a person and a pincushion. So that point is to reject idealism, the belief that reality depends on the content of our mind, like there is no objective reality outside of one's mind. The entities are withdrawn, the entities that are withdrawn, that we don't see, exist as well in reality independently from our minds. Okay, so this is the position of Hamann, and it is rejecting idealism. To quote him, idealism, however, is unworkable since there exists real things whose core reality is withdrawn from access even by themselves. And so the by themselves here at the end suggests that even things themselves have parts of themselves that are withdrawn from themselves. As an example would be like, you can't know your own thoughts, but just bits of them, all right? So even the mind is withdrawn from itself. But the point is that those entities, those withdrawn entities, well, they exist, period. So that's object-oriented ontology. Everything is an object on an immanent flat ontology. There is no transcendence. All objects are practically equal in terms of value. Objects are withdrawn, but their withdrawn entities exist objectively, and you are going to need more than science or direct observation to perceive them. So Morton applies this to global warming and also to hyperobjects, since global warming is a hyperobject. So he applies this to those entities that are withdrawn, and they're withdrawn on a whole other level because of their massive size. To quote Morton, because they so massively outscale us, hyperobjects have magnified this weirdness of things for our inspection. Things are themselves, but we can't point to them directly. Hyperobjects are not simply mental or otherwise ideal constructs, but are real entities whose primordial reality is withdrawn from humans. So in other words, there is such a huge gap between the thing and its appearance when it comes to hyperobjects, to the point where things get some sort of uncanny feeling to them. It's like when you buy a tomato at some market, but that tomato was produced on a very faraway farm that uses irrigation techniques that causes the soil to deteriorate, which causes the need for another industry to fix the soil, but the product needs to travel at such speed because of the energy that you have to use vehicles that consume so much energy and are emitting more CO2 in the atmosphere, more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which then causes sea levels to rise, which endangers the lives of already in danger illegal immigrants trying to cross some sea because they're fleeing extreme poverty in a country whose economic policies favor only one group of people while the rest are exploited, and that happens to be the same economic policies that require massive and aggressive agricultural industries and probably uses machines that stole the labor of the peasants that used to work there or own the land, etc., etc. So now you look at the tomato and it's weird, right? Because there is all of these things around it, and it's like the tomato is doing something to you. You know, when you look at the tomato and there is this whole history behind it, like how much it costs to be produced, and that the production of this tomato is also causing global warming. That has to do something, right? Like if you have this weird feeling when you buy groceries during climate crisis, then congrats, you are experiencing a hyperobject. To quote again from Morton, these entities cause us to reflect on our very place on Earth and in the cosmos. Perhaps this is the most fundamental issue. Hyperobjects seem to force something on us, something that affects some core ideas of what it means to exist, what Earth is, what society is. And so these questions that hyperobjects force us to ask are, according to Morton, something akin to Freud's concept of the three humiliations or blows to humanity. Like in 1917, it was in 17, I think, Freud wrote a text called A Difficulty on the Path of Psychoanalysis, in which he says that humans need to think that they used to think that they're the center of the universe, but then Copernicus shows up and turns out that the Earth isn't the center, but it is just rotating around the sun. That's called the cosmological blow. Then you have then humans, we're like, okay, no big deal. We still the center of creation, at least. We're made in the image of God, so we should be better than animals. And so Darwin shows up, and so that's the biological blow. And Freud puts himself as the bringer of the third blow, which is the psychological blow, by saying that human beings are not even the center of themselves, like your unconscious is more in charge than you are. And so that's the text, the difficulty on the path of psychoanalysis. That's the text in which you have that famous quote, "The ego is not the master of his own house, of his own home." And so there are many candidates that have been added for the fourth blow. Morton mentions Marx with his economic determinism, but you can also bring in another guy to take the title, Nicholas Luhmann, who is a hardcore social structuralist. And by the way, if you are into media theory and sociology, you can go check this guy. It's Hans-Georg Moeller from the YouTube channel Carefree Wandering, and he also wrote a good introduction to to Luhmann's thought called the radical Luhmann, in which he claims that Luhmann is the guy who brought the fourth blow. But you can also add post-structuralists like Derrida or Deleuze. But the fifth insult is, according to Morton, that goes to Triple O, which, in Morton's words, Triple O radically displaces the human by insisting that my being is not everything it's cracked up to be, or rather that the being of a paper cup is as profound as mine. And so this constant decentralization leads us to reconsider the creation of meaning. So far we've been giving meaning to the world in a certain way, but each time that meaning, the meaning that we give to the world gets blown up by a revolution of some sort, and we're left, to figure out what to do now. And so it is these moments of uncertainty in which meaning crumbles, in which our paradigms don't work anymore. It is these moments that Morton calls end of worlds. These are generated by crises like the ecological emergency, for example. Global warming calls on us to rethink everything that we've been doing so far, not just social or industrial organization, but even the very concept of being and how we inscribe meaning to the world. Quote, humans are not totally in charge of assigning significance and value to events that can be statistically measured. The worry is not whether the world will end, as in the old model of disastron, but whether the end of the world is already happening, or whether perhaps it might already have taken place. A deep shuddering of temporality occurs. And so the end of the world isn't some apocalyptic scenario like the earth will be, covered in sand, but it is more like the loss of meaning. And when we realize that there is nothing in charge of that meaning, or more accurately, that it's not human beings who are in charge of that meaning, when you feel like we've already reached the point of no return, like we're kind of in a dead end when it comes to global warming. Well, that's what we are dealing with here. Okay, like we're stuck within a universe that has no edges, and we don't know how to get out of it. That's it. We are stuck with global warming, and this situation also reminds us of the limits of language. Right? Remember when we said that there is no meta-language? Well, we used to think that language is a tool for naming objects, right? To give them meaning. Like I call this a pen, and so now I know what it is, and I know what it is for, right? It is to be used for writing, and that's it. And so this creates a hierarchy between the word and the object, in which the word confers meaning to the object, but not the other way around. Like the word pen affects this, but the object does not affect the word. And so the thing I call pen doesn't affect the word pen, the word affects it. So language is kind of outside, it is beyond the object, it transcends it, it looks down on it, kind of, and it is from a safe space. The language names it, and so the problem with hyperobject is that this transcending function, this meta function, let's say, well, it's cancelled because there is nothing outside of objects. The object we're in is what we call anthropocentrism. It's the Anthropocene. It's when you evaluate the world from the standpoint of human beings. Being in an Anthropocene makes us see the world in a certain way, and we take that representation as the real world, like as if we are outside of the world and we are looking at it from a certain beyond, but in reality we are trapped inside of a world, and that word is anthropomorphism. It's a word in which the human subject is at the center, or at least human perception is at the center. But of course, the meaning we give is not a meta-language. Our words are made from within the Anthropocene, and they are not referring to anything that would transcend it. All right. So hyperobject can show us that limit by grounding us in a bigger object. To quote Morton, what ecological thought must do then is unground the human by forcing it back onto the ground, which is to say, standing on a gigantic object called Earth inside a gigantic entity called biosphere. And so in short, you realize how tiny you are, that you are in an object, within a bigger object, like, you know, kind of like Rick and Morty, when there's that episode when they realize that they are in a simulation, inside of a simulation, inside of a bigger simulation. And so this realization of the limits of language, it prevents, in Morton's words, a reduction of thought. It prevents us from reducing anything in the world. When your meta-language is exposed for what it is, not a meta-language, it becomes difficult to make preferences, right? Because you come to see that everything is kind of interconnected and that you cannot really solve an issue while ignoring another, you know? That's something like from Philosophy Tube. Philosophy Tube released a video a few years ago about climate change in which...
Fish are dying because of global warming, right? So commercial fishing industries are losing money. And if you run a fish business, one of the easiest ways to save money is to pay the fishermen less and make them work in dangerous conditions. Since all the fishing happens at sea, it's hard for anyone to check. But if the crew tells anybody, you're going to have a lawsuit on your hands. So what do? You've got to hire undocumented migrants to go on the boats who can't complain and can't unionize, or they'll be arrested and deported. Some of the conditions in the commercial fishing industry basically meet the definition of modern slavery. So when it comes to fish, climate change, border controls, and labor rights aren't three separate issues. It's one big problem.
And in Morton's words, that translates as hyperobjects provoke reductionist thinking. That is, they present us with scalar dilemmas in which ontotheological statement about which thing is the most real, ecosystem, world, environment, or conversely individual, become impossible. And so this is like when you don't know what to prioritize in global warming. Should we like recycle or focus on renewable energy? Both? Should we focus on educating individuals? How? Which part of education is more relevant? Should we educate them to be sensitive to the environment, or should we invest in teaching them virtue or moral behavior? Like, it becomes very difficult. We can't really know what to do exactly because we're not operating from a detached point of view. Like maybe if we were some superior being who can look at global warming from an outsider perspective, like, you know, scientists would look at a fly, for example, but we're not operating from the outside. We're operating from the inside of global warming, from the perspective of human beings, from an anthropocentric point of view, you know, so we are operating from inside objects. We're like Jonah in the whale. To quote Morton, this means that every decision we make is in some sense related to hyperobjects. When I turn the key in the ignition of my car, I am relating to global warming. Yet my turning of the key is the ignition is intimately related to philosophical and ideological decisions stemming from the mathematization of knowing and the view of space and time as flat universal containers. So this is Descartes and Newton. The reason why the key transcends a signal to the fuel injection system, which starts the motor. The motor is one result of a series of decisions about objects, motion, space, and time. And so this leads us to a critique against capitalism that Morton argues that capitalism isn't good at dealing with global warming because it lacks the ontological and philosophical understanding of hyperobjects, like the things that we just mentioned with the car key. All of those things, they result from a series of decisions in a philosophical framework that does not include hyperobjects. All right, so if we are going to use the same things, the same kind of thinking that we have since Descartes and the capitalist kind of thinking, we are not going to be able to deal with hyperobjects. So a key turning your car cannot be related to global warming. So that's how the capitalist would think. That can come off as too abstract for the capitalist mind, and so that's kind of the problem. The capitalist doesn't want to speculate, so his kind of realism is, it's more like a reactive kind of realism than a proactive kind of realism. This means that capitalism deals with existing things that it can react to, that it can transform. It needs that something exists already, that something is already there, and it has to exist, as Morton says, as raw materials, whatever comes in at the factory door. The retroactive style of capitalism is reflected in the ideology of the consumer and its demands that capital then meets. So because of this flaw in capitalism, it just continue producing hyperobjects without even knowing it. And these hyperobjects, because of the threat that they pose, it can lead many to deny them. Quote again, the panic and denial and right-wing absurdity about global warming are understandable. Hyperobjects pose numerous threats to individualism, to nationalism, to anti-intellectualism, to racism, to speciesism, to anthropocentrism, you name it, possibly even to capitalism itself. And so this demand, the demand of the hyperobject, can be quite the challenge for someone who is reactive. Like the necessity of having clear distinctions between everything kind of puts too much trust in the very limited power of the mind, which will certainly just generate the kind of hubristic behavior of the wealthy and make them very cynical if you don't give them, easy solutions to a very complex problem that will not require that they'll change the system they're comfortable with. So saying that global warming is related to your car keys is kind of absurd for the capitalist. It is also absurd that global warming has anything to do with sexism or racism or poverty, and even capitalism for that matter. So that's the kind of things you'd hear from a capitalist, who doesn't want to reconsider the system he's profiting from. All right, and so this is basically the denial that you will find on the right. But as Morton writes, we have entered a time in which this kind of thinking is no longer relevant. Right? Hyperobjects demand that we adopt new kinds of philosophy, new ideologies, new art forms, so we need to be aware of the role that non-human objects play in this crisis, and we must look at them in a new, innovative way. To quote, all humans, I shall argue, are now aware that they have entered a new phase of history in which non-humans are no longer excluded or merely decorative features of their social, psychic and philosophical space. And this will require that, yes, we see objects as also autonomous beings that may have something to say about this crisis too. And so that's how Morton presents his project about hyperobjects. The rest of the book is divided into two parts. The first part is about the hyperobjects themselves. What are the hyperobjects, and in it he explores in details the 5 characteristics of hyperobjects, and which, remember, it's viscosity, non-locality, temporal undulation, phasing, and interobjectivity. Then in the second part, the time of hyperobjects, he goes through the different ways that hyperobjects have affected our ways of looking at the world, and he explains what he means by the end of the world, by the hypocrisies, which is hypocrisy, lameness, and weakness. And then in the last section, the age of symmetry, he goes into different art forms that convey hyperobjects and how objects themselves manage to convey their own meaning and freedom. So that's the introduction to the book. I will see you next time for an exploration for the first part of that book, what are hyperobjects, and then another video, which they're going to be way longer than this one, in which we are going to talk about the time of hyperobjects. Thank you, and